Then before we jump into continuing our discussion for today, one of the things we spoke about yesterday with the quarterly labor force survey was graduates, right, within the labor force. And I said I would take a look at the numbers and tell you. So I like the sentence at the beginning. Education is generally good insurance against unemployment. So you guys are currently insuring yourselves against unemployment. So what do the figures say about that? Well, first of all, I think that this number here is wrong. That's supposed to be 0%. So if we look at 2008 versus 2016 and just focus on 2016 at the moment, what our table is telling us here is that, well, graduates 15 to 19, 0% of them are, of those people that are 15 to 19, 0% of them are graduates, which makes sense because you're at school and it's pretty impossible for you to have graduated already. So that's why I think that 100% is a meaningless number. That's just a mistake on their part. So, what does it tell us about labor force participation? Of those people who have graduate degrees, nearly 90% of those people are part of the labor force. If you do not have a matric, only 50% of those people are actually part of the labor force. Right? So at least if you are a graduate, you have a good chance of being within the labor force, which means that you are at least looking for a job, even if you don't have one. If you have less than a matric, then you got less than 50% chance of even being in the labor force before you're even unemployed, right? Our next table, where is this table? Then there was a breakdown of by race in terms of that graduate education level, comparing 2008 to 2016. If you are black, you are less likely to have a degree and be employed. If you are white, you are more likely to have a degree and be employed, or if not a degree, there's a good chance you have at least a matric. If you are black and employed, you are less likely to have even a matric. So what that means is, when you look at this table and you look at who is employed where, those that are graduates are mostly employed in skilled labor. Skilled labor means, in general, high income labor. If you are low skilled, in other words, less than a matric, if you have less than a matric, you are more likely to be employed in low skilled labor. Which means, if you match these up with demographics, if you are black, you are more likely to be in low skilled employment. If you are white, you are more likely to be in high skilled employment. So if we want to understand things like inequality as well as questions of representativity at top management and that sort of thing, you can see that education plays a big part in those disparities. Yes? Yeah, absolutely.
So it comes down to that. We must also look at this information through that lens.
Yeah, you're right. So the population is about 10% white, 10% Indian, and a sort of a remainder being other people, maybe 5% everyone else. So if you're black, you make up about 75% of the population. And as we saw in the other diagram over here, sorry, let me just go up here. Where most people get employed, the largest number is community and social services, as someone pointed out. But community and social services is like a whole bunch of things lumped together. That's government, it's health services, it's whatever. Just put anything that's not agriculture, mining, manufacturing, etc., right? So apart from the fact that you can lump everything else together and get the biggest number as community and social services, the next biggest employers are your financial services or trade. Your low-skilled stuff is a very small percentage of the employment overall, relative. Which means if you are low-skilled, you have less chance of finding a job relative to those that are high-skilled, just given the amount of employment that is available. So once again then, if we look at these education figures, we see that education is a big problem. If the largest portion of society is also those that are less educated in general, then you're going to have the largest portion of society competing for the smallest pool of jobs, right? At very low wage levels. So if you want to try and tackle things like inequality, how do you deal with an issue like that? One of the things that civil society has recognized, of course, is the importance of education. And in the last 2 years, we've had a lot of upheaval in the tertiary education sector to say, well, for example, look at these employment figures. You need to be a graduate to get a job. Okay, you need to be a graduate to get a job. How many graduate, let's say, positions in university or in tertiary are there relative to, say, the size of the population? It's small. So we have a lot of social upheaval about tertiary education, and when you look at the size of the problem at a lower level, what about primary education and secondary education? So yes, tertiary education, there needs to be a lot of changes to the way that it's done, but before you even get to tertiary, there are big issues in the South African economy at a secondary school level. Yeah.
Do you have any idea whether certain graduates have been responsible for finding a job that like in terms of faculty?
Do I myself?
Yeah.
I mean, I have an idea of it. I don't have any particular figures available, but yeah. I mean, if you're a commerce graduate, you're pretty likely to find one. Sciences, you're pretty likely to. Humanities, less likely. And it also depends what kind of pay package you are targeting. So generally engineering and law and commerce in general, accounting specifically, has a very clear kind of track for employment. In other words, if safety is what you want, accounting is a pretty good route to go. I'm not so sure about job satisfaction. Doesn't float my boat, but anyway. Okay. Any other issues, questions? Okay. So we spoke at the end of yesterday about inflation. We got an introduction to inflation, talking about the price level and how the fact that when we talk about prices, what is it that we mean when we talk about inflation and deflation? Inflation means that prices are rising, and not just once off or just a little bit, but continuously rising. Alternatively, deflation would mean that prices are consistently decreasing. So what does inflation actually look like then? So this is the consumer price index for the most recent one, which was released in January. What does our inflation look like currently? Well, the current index is set to December 2016, so our base year is 100. December 2016, here's our base period, set to 100. In January 2016, it was 94.6. In January, by the end of January 2017, it was 100.6. In other words, our prices had already increased by 0.6% in 1 month. What was inflation during 2016? I leave that to you to calculate quickly. You've got the January 2016, it was 94.4. December 2016, the index is 100. What was inflation during this period? Yeah? 6%? Was it 6%? 5.6? 5.6 divided by 94.4 equals? $5.9. Okay? So you're happy with that? During 2016, prices increased by, well, they went from 94.4 to 100. So 100 minus 94.4 divided by 94.4 equals some percentage change, which was 5.9%. Great. What is our inflation? How has it looked over some period of time? Oh, wait, this is the wrong one. Here we go. So you can see our price index has been set to 100 in 2016 for the month of December. When we adjust every other year according to that base period, we see that, for example, in January 2016, so January 2016, it's 94.4. In February, it was 95.7. March, April, May. Can you see that prices are consistently increasing? It's not like prices just went up once and that was it, right? These prices are just going up and up and up and up. What does this mean? It means that if you bought something for 100 Rand in December 2016, that same thing would have cost you 1 Rand 20 in 1960. Okay, 1 Rand 20 in 1960 to 100 Rand in. Alrighty. Something in 1994, it would have cost you 25 Rand for that thing. When were you guys born? What year? 95, 97, 6. Okay. So between 25 and 30 Rand. Something when you were born, that's what it would have cost. Now costs you 100 Rand. Between 1994, from 25 Rand to 2004 to nearly 50 Rand, that means in 10 years, it almost doubled, which means an average of 7% inflation during that period per year. From 2004 to 2014, didn't quite double, so inflation for that decade, a little bit less than 7% per year. Between 1984 and 1994, we go from 7 to 25. That's almost quadruple. That's almost 4 times, which means inflation during that period averaged around 13% per year. Yeah.
Was there a recession in 2013 to 2014?
In the South African economy, do you mean? I don't have a GDP figure. I should have got some GDP figures. That would be nice. Seeing as we've done GDP, but I'll come back to that. So South African GDP, what does it look like over time? During the from 94 to the early 2000s, so the Mandela and Mbeki area, great economic growth, slows down a little bit, and then 2008 we have the financial crisis and Zuma comes into power. Bit of a double whammy there. And no, we haven't. So we had a recession. Technically, we had a recession at about this period. We haven't really technically had a recession since then, but our growth has been at about 1%.
I was asking because 2013 to 2014,
Yes.
inflation seems to not be the same as 2008 to 2009.
Right, got you. This is low growth. So you're right, this was close to, I think we had like technically a small recession in this period. And since then, this slow inflation has also coincided with pretty anemic growth. Some quarters of negative growth, but a technical definition for a recession is 2 consecutive quarters of negative growth. And we've just avoided having 2 consecutive quarters. So our growth in the 90s is looking good. It's around 5%, and then it just kind of collapses. During the 80s, you can see horrendous time, inflation out of control, the National Party trying their best to blame everyone but themselves. A lot of similarities to our current state of affairs. In the 60s, there was a gold standard. South Africa exported gold. Our currency was really, really strong. Very low inflation during the 60s. During the 70s, picks up a little bit. There's a lot of, as you know, 1977. That's a bit of a hectic year politically. Politics in the 70s, making people a bit uneasy. During the 80s, it's a nightmare. During the end of the 80s, early 90s, even more of a nightmare. And then the 90s, we have high inflation in the beginning of the 90s, but it's also accompanied with high growth, and it's looking good. And then, yeah, our last decade has not looked quite as good as the previous decade. So, yeah, that's how it looks. Yeah. Is it avoidable? As in, can you ever have deflation? Yeah. Japan has had deflation for about, I don't know, I think it's about 25 years now or something. Yeah, good question. Yeah, that's a complicated story. If you're interested in it, you should have a read. But basically, they had a problem in the 90s. There was like a sort of a bubble that happened, and I think it was driven by property as well. That bubble kind of collapsed. They've got very high employment. They've got very high technological growth. There's a lot of downward pressure on prices through improvements through efficiency, for example. But their population dynamics are also their population's not growing in the way that you would want it to grow for, I don't know, to have some inflation, you would want some population growth. In other words, one of the drivers of inflation would be an increasing population, so increasing demand. What they've got is increasing supply, which lowers prices with demand not kind of keeping pace, so you've got downward pressure on prices, which has, yeah, maybe made their economy not grow as well as it would have otherwise, yeah?
Is the annual consumer inflation rate always higher than the monthly inflation rate for market-based inflation?
I mean, it is, but it doesn't have to be. In other words, let me give you an example. If we go back to those... Oh, here we go. Sorry, I'm just trying to find out exactly where I am. Oh, here we go. Okay. So if you can imagine each one of these monthly, right? Each one of these there's inflation each month, right? So in between each one of these months will be some amount of inflation, right? Your annual inflation is going to be an average of what that inflation was during the period, right? Now, if you have some months where you have very high inflation followed by months where there's very low inflation, your average annual inflation is going to be in between that, right? In which case your annual wouldn't necessarily always be higher than your monthly, or it wouldn't always be lower than your monthly. There's really no connection. You're asking because of a TUT question. Yeah. Okay, cool. Sorry, yeah, did someone else, you as well? I'll go there and then, yeah.
They take into account like how quantities have gone down. So it's still the same price, like something that was 100 grams is now like 83 grams.
Yeah, so consumer price index, what do they put in there? They just released a thing in December now. In fact, I closed it. Oh well. They just released one now in January, where they've updated the basket. So they're continuously updating the basket. What is in the basket? So this one was from 2013. I'm not sure. I couldn't find like a more updated basket. But what is in this basket? Anyone want to think of some kind of a good? Some good. Wheat. Is that W-H-E-A-T? Okay, wheat itself, that's too broad. What would you like? Bread. Okay, bread and cereals. Rice, white bread, brown bread. Biscuits, bread rolls. Right? Okay, what else? Just to give you an example. Right? There's a lot of stuff in here, right? It's like everything that you use all the time, it goes in here. So does it take account of the fact that they change over periods of time? Absolutely. Yeah. With the which thing? Figures in general, yeah? Yes, and the banks? Yes, yeah. Yes. I'm not. So you're saying that you're questioning the legitimacy of the numbers because you feel they may be manipulated. Is that kind of what you're saying? Certainly, the numbers that they gather are the numbers that are in the shops, right? How the shops set their prices is not part of this. In other words, here we are looking at actual change in prices. How those prices change, I think, is what you're talking about, right? What is the competitive? How competitive is the industry versus, say, what about monopoly issues, right? And price fixing issues. I mean, that's reflected in these numbers. We would have no idea how much of these numbers, we don't know how much these numbers are affected by things like that. If that's what you're kind of getting at.
But don't you think that everything, these big companies, they are also operating in cartels?
Yeah.
In case shop rights,
Okay.
in terms of the food industry, the simple financial services and all that.
Okay, so even if you had high levels of collusion within any industries, right, the CPI index would still be reflecting how they were changing their prices. In other words, these prices are correct in terms of what you see in the shops. How those prices happen in those shops, yeah, this index doesn't tell you anything about that. But those are definitely interesting questions. Okay. So the price level, we've seen the CPI, what it looks like in the South African economy. Why we ended our discussion yesterday talking about why inflation is potentially an issue. One of the things that it does is it redistributes income. In other words, between workers and employers. If your inflation is unexpected, there will be unanticipated redistribution of income. You also get redistribution of wealth. That it has the potential to lower our actual GDP, and it diverts resources from production. How might it lower real GDP? Well, if you have unexpected inflation, the example that they give here, which again, this is a contentious kind of issue, but we'll just go with what the textbook says. If you have unexpected inflation, prices are going up, shops think that the economy is doing well. What do? They invest more. By investing more, you increase production and employment. But this increase in investment is not based on increased general economic activity. It's based on an increase in prices, which means that once prices start increasing, you've overinvested, and in fact, when prices stop increasing, you've overinvested, and then investment falls, and so real GDP falls. I wouldn't worry too much about their explanation. Let's just say that it can affect inflation. Unexpected inflation does have an influence on real GDP or employment. Whether it lowers that or decreases it, that's up for debate. Of course, if it has an impact on real GDP or employment, or where resources are being directed generally, then of course we could be diverting resources from where they're supposed to be to places where they're not supposed to be. Okay? So how do we measure inflation? We measure inflation with the CPI. So the CPI, this is a measure of inflation. When we calculate CPI, as we've already alluded to in our discussion so far, CPI is an index, right? So an index means a way of comparing prices okay, and we compare those prices over time. And in order to do that, we choose one base year. We say, right, let's compare how prices change relative to our base year. Okay? Comparing prices over time relative to some base year. And it's completely irrelevant what your base year is. We saw in those South African CPI figures, the base period happens to be at this point set at, December 2016. Once we know the base period, we can then calculate the index for every other period relative to that period. Then when we want to calculate inflation, all we need to look at is the change in the number. So say this number, 69.1, the change in that number relative to 100, and that would give us the change in inflation between the base period and the period we're interested in. Or if we're interested in looking at inflation between any other periods, say we wanted to look at December 2009, 69.1 versus January 2015, 89.9. Then we compare the number 89.9 with 69.1, and that gives us inflation during that period. Okay? We'll look at the exact equation in a moment. How do we construct the CPI? We select a basket of goods. What goes into this basket? Just about anything you can imagine that you purchase on a daily basis, and over time the basket slowly changes, right? So in the January press release where they said they had updated the basket, they had updated the basket to include, amongst other things, frozen pies and frozen pizza. Okay? So those were not in the basket before, they're in the basket now. They had increased the basket by about, I think it was something like 50 additional items. So there are currently something like 470 items that go into the CPI basket. There's a lot of things in there. So it contains the goods and services represented in the index, and each is weighted by its importance. So they don't just throw a whole bunch of things into the basket, they also weight that basket. In other words, if people on average buy 1 liter of milk to 2 loaves of bread, then the weighting in the basket must be 1 liter of milk to 2 liters of bread, right? That's how they weight it. So if your entire budget spend in the month is 2% on milk and 4% on bread, then that basket must be made up with 2% milk, 4% bread. You get it? How do they gather this information? Surveys, right? Each month, the people at Stats SA go into the shops and they go, right, bread, 12 Rand 50. They write that down. Okay? They go into different shops, into different parts of the country to work out the basket. So when we want to calculate the CPI, what do? We find the cost of a basket. If we're going to have a base year, we find the cost of the basket in the base year. We then want to find the cost of the basket in whatever current year we're looking at. And then to calculate the CPI, we say, right, let's compare the base year's prices to the current year's prices. So what is CPI? The cost of the basket in your current year divided by the cost of the basket in your base year, obviously times 100 to give you a percentage number. So if your basket in the current year costs 118 and your basket in the base period costs 100, then your CPI would be 1.18 times 100. Yeah, so that will give you 118. Yes?
When they say the basket of bread and stuff, there's different prices for different types of bread.
Correct.
So would it just all the breads put together at an average price, or would you do certain prices there?
Yeah, it depends. I mean, they'll have a specific, when they say white bread, they'll have a breakdown of exactly how they've calculated white bread. And it'll be different for different types of products. But yeah, what you're saying is approximately correct. Yeah. How then do you calculate CPI? Well, how do you calculate inflation? You take the CPI in whatever year you're looking at, minus the CPI of whatever other year you're looking at, and divide it by the initial year. So the inflation rate in a single period or in a single year, so inflation rate in 1 year would be CPI this year minus CPI last year divided by CPI last year. That would be the inflation rate for 1 year. The inflation rate for a month would be CPI this month minus CPI last month divided by CPI last month. Okay. So let's look at a quick example of this. If the cost of our basket, we're calculating CPI here. If the cost of a basket in 2012 is the following: oranges and haircuts constitute our basket. The quantity of oranges that we buy is 10. The quantity of haircuts that we have is 5. The price of an orange is 1 Rand. The price of a haircut is 30 Rand. Therefore, we spend 10 Rand on oranges, 150 Rand on haircuts. Add those two together. The cost of the basket, 160 Rand. If we make 2012 our base year, then the base year prices are 160 Rand. What about then if we fast forward 1 year to 2013, we find that the price of oranges has gone up, the price of haircuts has gone up, therefore the price of the basket has gone up. What was our CPI then in 2012? The CPI in 2012, 2012 is our base year. What is the calculation for CPI? The cost of the basket in the current year divided by the cost of the basket in the base year. In 2012, the cost of the basket is 160, and 2012 is the base year. Therefore, 160 divided by 160 gives you 100. This is our base year. Our index is therefore set at 100. Why is our base year always set at 100? Because you're always going to divide the price of the basket by itself. Right? It's always the price of the basket divided by itself times 100 gives you price index 100. What about then for 2013? What is the CPI in 2013? CPI 2013, the cost of the basket in 2013, right? Oh man. Okay, cost of the basket in 2013, and I can't make it an arrow right now, so let me just. There we go. Cost of the basket in 2013 divided by the cost of the basket in the base year. When was our base year? 2012. Divided by 160 gives you the CPI of 137. What is the inflation rate then for 2013? CPI in 2013, which is 137.5, minus the CPI in the previous year, which was 100, divided by 100 times 100. What is our inflation rate during that period? 37.5%. You happy with that? So, again, how do you calculate the CPI? Cost of the basket in the base year, cost of the basket in the current year, divide current year by base year gives you CPI. And it looks like it's time for a break. Is that right? Cool. Let's have a quick break and then we'll finish this off.